it is that way because of what we are, and what we are is shaped by an infinity, both inwardly and outwardly. Our will is our existence.
Good morrow, fellow humans. Sean here. I'm currently walking down through the Arboretum in Mount Dandenong, not too far from where I live. Just looking for a place so that we can sit down and we can have a bit of a discussion and a recap on everything that unfolded last year. So specifically, I want to look at your comments and share with everyone some of the conversations that we had, so we can get an idea as to where the current narrative of the infinite now stands.
I found a position. I had to take a couple of attempts at it, because the first attempt that I did meant that I ended up being covered in leeches. But I'm now at this second position, and I'm ready to start unfolding these ideas. There's a bit to get through. There's a lot of amazing conversations that we had. I have my notes right here in front of me, so I will be looking off camera from time to time, sometimes reading excerpts from the certain chapters, sometimes reading the comments that you've made and the discussions that we've had. But let's get into it. So the very first episode, a pause in the crazy. There's an opening statement that lays out a pathway for us. We don't know how we're getting there, but here's what we say. We say, there is infinity within every finite measure. For this is a cosmos that denies all prophecy of hierarchy. A unified embrace of all that ever was, is, shall, or shan't be, omitting not even the categorical antithesis of infinite nothing herself. It is a wholeness whose infinite is of a qualitative oneness. And this is what we are. Now, philosophy often works in two ways. You have very dense language. Thinkers like Kant, very analytical, very definite and intentional with their language. But then, especially with the pre-Socratic philosophers, you have more of a philosophical language. And even these later thinkers, they do dabble with more poetic prose. Even Nietzsche can jump into a poetic turn of phrase every now and then. And that's what this is. The intention is to offer an emotive idea that is going to give us a look into something that exists between the lines. And I think that's an important place to start, but not necessarily somewhere where we can stay, because we're all here looking for insight. But the point of that first episode was that we shone a light on science and its confidence to be able to master these riddles of reality, and notice the fact that in modern times philosophical discord has been somewhat pushed to one side. The realization of mortality and how it shapes both our questions and answers, whether we should ask why or whether we should ask how, and the fact that why seemed to be entwined with a mortal perspective, whereas how was able to persist regardless of the individual who is asking the questions. At least that's how it seems. So at that fork in the road, what we choose to do at the end of that very first episode is to move forward with the question how, because we need the how to inform the why. In the same way that we're going to need the more analytical approach to shed a light on that more poetic approach. Upon these first couple of videos, there you were, some of these faces that have been popping up time and time again. The first arrival of names like Phony McPhoneson, Colin McGowan, Lord Snuggles, Pra 1966, who the two of us just every episode would share a single emoji to one another, often dog related. and did that for an entire year. These people, I don't know who you are, you don't know who I am really, but the fact that we're just sharing this little moment and connection really, slowly over time has built friendship. So I appreciate that. The main takeaway of that episode was that no part of the universe, or no part of reality, can ever be considered large or small compared to the whole. That was the lesson that we got from that thought experiment. It states, we should not imagine this infinite expanse, miniaturization of the universe as a type of growing, with the expansion on the right and the miniaturization happening on the left. We instead imagine the infinite smallness to exist everywhere that the infinite largeness does. They are the exact same space, only viewed through different eyes. And that's a key phrase. That's a little Easter egg, that line. The exact same space, viewed through different lines. And I use that line several times throughout the book, throughout the series. Pay attention to when that pops up, because it's tying back to this same idea. So from that point, we went on to chapter 2, an even briefer history. Here we are at the first unfoldings of our idea of time. But we start the process by looking at Carl Sagan's cosmic calendar. Look at the universe from its birth, in terms of a Big Bang birth, all the way through to the photon age, which is an epoch that happens post the heat death of the universe. This led to one of my favourite comments of the entire year, which was from @MarkBurl, who said, "This feels like I'm going to a work conference in Vegas. Show up at the hotel, the receptionist gives the conference room number, go to said banquet room, realize it's not my work conference, stay anyways, mind blown, and now I hope to get fired from my slave wage job. Thanks." And thank you to you. I just really enjoyed that comment. This is another one I wanted to share with you. It was a comment by @GodsLittleGuy, who said, "Cool, inquisitive mind, but your belief and loyalty to the prominent pronounced beliefs of the day is a major blind spot. We've been lied to by our rulers for millennia. But it's fun to ponder that they're telling us the truth and their hypotheses aren't meant to control and extract our energy in it." Now, I understand that there was sarcasm in that, but I think it was important to follow up the compliment with the flip side, which is the dismissal of these ideas. And it brought to my attention the idea that there are two types of people that enjoy this type of content and enjoy the deeper philosophical riddles. Those who are excited to know of reality and know and how it operates beyond just the finite minutiae of humanity and our politics, and those who feel outraged because they've discovered that the structures of civilization might not be as stable as they once had thought, and so these people feel lied to. So the only thing that I noticed was that the latter style of comments always seemed to be rooted in fear. It was showcased as anger, but it was rooted in this idea of fear, that there was something in the broader world that we needed to be worried about because we're being lied to. And I think that a lot of people can relate to that. I think that there's a certain element of truth to that comment, but that fear that leads to a dismissal of science, especially, I don't think is a healthy response. Science works because it acknowledges its limitations. That might not be what gets presented to the public. It might not be what's shown in the clickbait titles, but it is important that science recognizes that it is not necessarily uncovering ultimate truths, but relative ones. And I think that science was actually an experiment in that practice and has succeeded because of it. Those who actually work with this thinking day in, day out know that it's always in flux. All knowledge is in flux. And then that opens up the philosophical question, can anything be known for sure at all. But it's just interesting to point out at this point that there are those two ways of looking at this. That there's these two types of people that are interested in discussing the nature of reality. Those that are wanting to shut down and warn and wave a flag and tell us that the end is nigh, and those that are happy to just contemplate nature for a while. I try to acknowledge the validity of all takes and all opinions, because that's going to be a big part of the philosophy that unfolds, not for a moral reason, but for a metaphysical reason. As I said, no part of the universe, no part of reality can ever be considered big or small compared to the whole. I've got another comment here from Andre Benevides. This was a really interesting take in relation to what we were just speaking about. Andre said, I believe that I'm a rare case of a non-materialist theoretical physicist. I dove deeply into materialism during my 20s. To me, that was just self-evident. I couldn't see any way out of it. The world was made of matter that obeyed the laws of physics, and that was all reality was to me back then. At some point, my rational castle started to erode a little bit. It wasn't all at once. I started to get interested in the mind, in archetypes, in Jung's ideas. I completely believed the world was made of matter, but I started to see the world we experience as something different from the world of physics, or something different from the world that physics describes. At this point, I felt that there was a space in my mind's world for gods, for spiritual practices, and all of that. About a year ago, a few experiences completely demolished my rational castle. I felt a deep fear. I wanted to unsee what I had seen. I wanted my comfortable material world back, but it was gone. My views shifted drastically. Reality became a big mystery for me, something that I didn't believe could be explained. There was an unreachable miracle at the core of existence. Nowadays, I acknowledge reality as this deep mystery which I'm not separate from, but I see myself as a manifestation of this mystery. I've since then lost interest in explaining the mystery and shifted my focus to living and being it. I would not say I know the world is made of matter. Maybe it is, but we will never know. We will always live with this deep mystery, and I'm okay with it now. So thank you for that, Andre. I'm sure that resonates with many people. There's a shorter comment here from Donny G, 1984. He says, There was a question to this point. Are the demons of today actually the angels of tomorrow, who roughly guided the collective onto a path towards revealing the higher self? It's an interesting question. But my response to him, I'll read my exact response, is to this same point, that nothing is ever wholly good or bad. Good and bad are names that we attribute to the spectrum of happenings. But this spectrum is actually of the same oneness. We only know good and it's counter to bad, and vice versa. They give shape and meaning to one another, just like on and off, or life and death. So the wholeness that lies behind it all doesn't judge as we do. Judgments of good and evil are only finite shapes that we cut from the otherwise homogeneous background. But with all that said, from within our finite perspective, we can interact and know of the actualities of goodness and evil, here and here specifically, rather than in the higher self, is where such things are real. And so for me, it is here within the personal frame where I give validity to choice via a meaning that is unique to the frame of the observer. And from within that frame, I choose love. Not for any ultimate ends, but for the now that I find myself in. Worlds will continue to come and go, but nothing ever truly arrives or leaves. So that's where we're at, and that's only the first opening ideas of Act 1. The first ideas of just playing with these thought experiments. How do we think about the nature of reality, the what is? We haven't even gotten into the nature of time properly yet, but that is where we go next. This is where we really started our unfolding. Everything prior to that has just been a warm-up. This is where we really started trying to do philosophical, metaphysical work. And we start with that question, what is time? This is one of my favorite questions. And I think probably one of the best topics to meditate on, to really crack open, apart from infinity, to really crack open that way of inquiring into reality like a philosopher. But of course we're asking how. We're not asking why at this point in the story. So we talk of the beginning and ends of time, the singularities being confused for ultimate ends when perhaps they're continuations. But as a result, these scientific theories, they inform our metaphysics. As Stephen Hawking said, asking what was before the Big Bang is like asking what is north of the North Pole. It's not that the answer is nothing, it's that the question is wrong and that we must continue our search for better questions. Colin McGowan, 1956, said, if the concept of infinity actually exists, either as time or as something spatial, then at the bottom of it would be the proof of non-duality. There can't actually be more than one infinity. If something is actually infinite, it will include everything that is. How can something be infinite and not include all ideas, concepts, and objects, etc.? Anyway, the main takeaways of those 3 chapters was that infinities are not borders between an isness and a nothingness. That was an important thing that we took away from that chapter. Reality doesn't begin or end with singularities. It only shifts gears through them. Big bangs are not the emergence of stuff, but the emergence of relationships. And it's these relationships that we often identify as the fundamental constants, those that shape the universe as it's known in respect of our finite relative frame. And the last thing was that nothingness is paradoxical. So they were the main takeaways. Now that's a Parmenidean concept. That's the philosopher Parmenides, who is a pre-Socratic philosopher. And he is a non-dual thinker. It states that all is one. And for that reason, what is. What is not, isn't. It can't be pointed to, considered. It doesn't exist. It's not. What is not doesn't exist as part of reality. Now you don't have to agree with that, but that's where we came to at the end of that chapter, that nothingness is paradoxical. So is there time without change? Just like the mirage of ultimate borders, time as a thing unto itself can only ever be appreciated in relative terms. So if we wish to consider the topic of time properly, then it now seems abundantly clear that we must first determine what perspective we are considering time from. From what perspective are we choosing that time either does or does not exist, that it is equal or not equal to change? And that was how we closed those chapters, with that question, with that realization that we needed to move on to the observer first and foremost. We can't talk about space-time. We can't talk about any form of scientific, mathematical, experimental reality. We can't talk about it unless we acknowledge the frame from which we are perceiving it. But because we're looking at the observer, the thinker, the frame from which we're asking these questions, we move on quickly to the idea of free will. So we look into the nature of free will, because if we have free will, this says something about time. If we have free will, if we have the ability to choose, then that means that the future is open-ended. It means that it hasn't been decided yet. This one fly. Swear to God, it's got a whole forest, and it's just hanging around here. Free will. But again, that human story was brought into the chat. Richard Deese 1087, or Tavi, as he's like to be referred, asked, if you don't believe you have free will, why get out of bed? And that's the question, isn't it? You know, he says, my feeling is that whether people have free will or not, it's important for us to believe we do. I'm concerned that people might decide a lack of free will also gives them an excuse. It's a moral argument, not a logical one, but I feel it matters. The way I responded was that many religious people presume the lack of spiritual judgment will result in people abandoning morality. But the truth is they don't, because we each have our own moral compass. The reason we don't do bad things is because we don't want to do bad things. Choice is a reaction to a situation, but our chapter's question wasn't whether choice is real or not, it's whether choice is deterministically reactive, just like pretty much everything else in physics. Or if there was some element of our consciousness that enabled it to act outside of and separate from ordinary physical cause and effect, which is actually, in my opinion, as I write to Tavi, a far more incredible claim. If free will, if the nature of consciousness allows us to make choice in a way that separates us from reality, in a way that means that we can act above it. You know, a rock gets hit, it goes moving. It didn't choose to do that. That's just cause and effect. But if free will exists, that means that consciousness has an ability to step outside of cause and effect. Which is why, if that's true, that's a massive claim. And it says something very deep about what consciousness is, which is why many material-minded scientists actually deny it. They don't believe in free will. Many people today deny free will exists. Everything is a matter of cause and effect. My personal take is not that the universe imposes itself upon us, but rather that we are the universe. So the act of will is like gravity. We've just abstracted it from the nature of everything else that's going on. We call it will. It's not deterministic in the sense that it was always going to be that way. It's just that it is that way because of what we are, and what we are is shaped by an infinity, both inwardly and outwardly. Our will is our existence. Our will is our force of truth. The fact that we are a thing means that we have influence. Then you can look at it from a non-dual perspective and remove the thingness. Now, once you remove the thingness, you remove the self, the body, the separate entity, and then it's all just one flow. It's one thing all happening. But if you want to abstract the self as being a thing, then sure, will is a thing. It's happening inward outwardly as at the same time as happening outwardly inwardly. We're an infinite nexus. And when you try and verbalize that, you need to break the flow into parts, into concepts, into ideas. And the term free will is as good as any to describe the influence of choice. But then we've also abstracted the idea of influence. We've also abstracted the idea of choice. So nothing we can describe yet, nothing that I'm offering has been able to land an ultimate ground floor truth, an element of elementary fact. Everything is subject to an observer's frame. The main takeaway of that was that we'd be hard-pressed to unfold the bafflement that comes from trying to understand time until we can untangle the issues of conscious time versus non-conscious time. Time that exists beyond the perspective, beyond the frame, and time for us. It says, the more profound question, Has the brain evolved to sense time, or has the brain evolved to interpret a reality that is simply other, generating the time we experience as a byproduct? And curiously, this then brings us back to our earlier idea of a universe without consciousness. For if there is no experiencer capable of determining a now from then, can we say that time still passes? Beyond consciousness, does the arrow of time always follow its linear path? Is there a universal present that persists beyond that which is relevant to the individual? We did an episode of unfoldings at that point, which is similar to what we're doing now, and that was called Exploring Reality's Dependence on Observers. And Yeehaw Buddy commented, "Reality is the observer," which I then asked, playing the devil's advocate, so does the observer observe self or other? To which Yeehaw Buddy said, when you look in the mirror, are you looking at you or the one looking into the mirror? Chapters 7, 8, and 9, we begin our investigation inquiring into the nature of emergence. And I use the metaphor of the old ancient question, what came first, the chicken or the egg? That's a question that you could easily answer. You just say, the egg. Why the egg? Because dinosaurs had eggs. Chickens weren't around. Genius. Done. Case closed. However, the concept of the chicken is a subjective abstraction. There's no point in the evolutionary history of that animal when you go, not chicken, chicken. You can make a line, but that's a subjective abstraction. So that's not what the question is asking, what came first, chicken or the egg. The question is much deeper than that. And we get into why it's deeper, we follow those threads, but essentially we draw a parallel and ask the same question in a different way. What came first, colour or the eyes? What came first, life or death? And all three of those seem to have a knee-jerk first response. Colour existed before eyes, otherwise eyes wouldn't have seen the colour. Life existed before death because you can't die if you're not living, right? So they seem to be obvious first port of call responses to these questions. But when you look into it closer, you realize, like with the chicken, the nature of the chicken, that each term is always a subjective line in the sand. I state that the main takeaways for the chapter are answers that declare themselves definitive always hide a fundamental subjective framing. And then there's an important quote from the book here. By ignoring the vast majority of its environment, consciousness has tricked itself into seeing itself. That's what consciousness does. It's a subjective finite frame. And because of that, because of its finite nature, it ignores the infinity that's happening. And by doing that, it only appreciates what it appreciates, cutting itself off from the wholeness of flux and oneness. And in that act, it can see itself. But it needed to ignore the infinity to be able to see itself. By ignoring the vast majority of its environment, consciousness has tricked itself into seeing itself. However, whether subjective or not, change is always achieved via process, not digital ticks. of clocks or throws of switches. The digital understanding is a quality of our language, not the universe itself. Nothing emerges, nothing ends, as all is continuous. And yet those shapes we name do nonetheless host a certain element of validity. Their actuality is just as real as the continuous process is. It's just that their validity and their uniqueness is found in the finite perspective. So it doesn't deny their existence. The finite, abstracted, subjective quality of nature is not diminished because we realize that that's what it is. It's actually just appreciating it for what it is. It is a part of the tapestry. It is an aspect of what is. The finite subjective opinion, the individualness of consciousness does exist. It's just, again, like everything else, it's not that ultimate isness, that ultimate non-subjective, non-arguable truth. It's not, it's a relative finite truth. Another comment playing with the idea of perspectives was given by Silberline, and Silberline, unbeknownst to myself whilst we started chatting, was using a Google Translator, because Silberline, native tongue was German, and trying very hard to keep up with me using an English-German Google Translator. But this is what they said. They did an excellent job, by the way. They said, I say that the central point is that we, as the people we are, see and feel infinity the way we see and feel it. My response was that I'm asking a question. Is it all just perspective? Or is it a perspective of something? And if a perspective of something, what is that which can be perceived an infinite count of ways and yet still have a particular identity? I do think that it's a perspective of something that can be perceived in an infinite number of ways depending on the type and consciousness looking at it. Nevertheless, it has a certain identity of its own. This is my response. What if two unique observers have two polar experiences? One sees an aspect of the grander something as white, another sees it as black. In fact, because we have infinite perspectives, we know that there would be an infinite count of black and white views. Now, of course, all views are limited in their translation because their finite qualities shape their attention. So we already know that they're not wholly accurate translations. But if views can be entirely polar, how can they both have partial correctness? We could suggest that there are an infinite number of correct and an infinite number of incorrect perspectives, but this would mean that consciousness is just as capable of invention as it is attention. And thus atop those that reflect truth, there would also be an infinite number of perspectives that are entirely fantasy. And so there would be no need for an eternal reality to be translated, as any perspective could be wholly fantasy. To which Silberlini said, in the beginning, you follow reality logically, as you usually do in life, on the level of the mind. This is the first step that can be taken to move out of the mind, to first go deep into it. He said to me, the eye with which I see God is exactly the same eye with which God sees me. I said to him, show me this eye. Now this means the reason that we can't see God with our eyes is that we can't see what is one. We need to abstract the oneness into a multiplicity for it to be. And again, that takes us right back to the start, the idea of seeing and knowing, to describe things poetically and to offer ideas that exist between the lines. Chapter 8, we'll skip by here. All it is a history of quantum mechanics, and we offer an example of the Stern-Galash experiment. And I'll let you go and look at that chapter if you want. It was relevant to the flow of the story that we give a bit of a look into what the current understanding of quantum mechanics is, but I don't need to go into it here. Chapter 9 So we discussed the apparent boundaries between what we've been talking about, between reality and perception. So we began with a walkthrough of the history of mind-body dualism. And then we went on to ponder the materialism of neuroscience, asking whether we are the brain, or mind, or body, or spirit. And we looked at examples which included Plato's thinking and his allegory of the cave. And his allegory of the cave is this same story, that we are like a man sitting in a cave, looking at shadows on the wall. He has a fire and he sees the shadows dancing on his cave wall. And that's what he likens human experience to. Katie wants to go. Katie? Katie, yes. Katie wants to go. Hello to you. You have popped up many times in the chats, and they said, I am bound to know such interpretations. Which is pretty bold, because there is no limit to how much I don't know. And this, in fact, disrupts the flow of interpretation. I cannot assign an interpretation to something unknown. Personal experience is the only semi-trustworthy experience worth having. I can't have your trip, you can't have mine. We can share similarities, should there be any, but I'm on my path and you're on yours. In other words, trying to establish truth based on interpretation is like pouring a foundation of what you think is concrete but might be grey mud. So I understand what she's saying there. What they're saying there. They're saying we can't say that what we're experiencing is interpretation because we can't even know that for a fact. So if we cannot know that this is an interpretation of something else, like Plato would be suggesting, then all we really have is the experience. All we have is the first-person experience. That is what we really have access to. So we briefly considered the philosophical implications of a self that lasts for an eternity, how the physical self is constantly changing, and even the mental self is constantly changing. If we did live for forever, is it really the same person? An infinite self, by its very nature, would have no ultimate character. It would be as good as just being every individual person on this planet, one at a time. An infinite self that had to continuously change. It's like a continuous Doctor Who. But if taking on the materialistic interpretation of self, then the continuous nature of the physical world would deny the potential for a unique intrinsic self. We could name it a self, but the name is again attached to an abstracted explication. It says, throughout the ages, a letting go of the ego has often been highlighted as the path towards enlightenment. But for the vast majority of us, for those unwilling to take on the risks of psychedelics, or unable to invest their precious time into a rigorous meditation practice, all we envision when we hear of such intense ego dissolution is a straightforward, unromantic loss of self, a fall into the abyss, an endless, loveless darkness. Without the I, what am I? And boldly here enters our fear of death. So at that point, I'll just take another comment from the comment section. This was from Brian Drawn 9830. Sorry if I mispronounce anyone's names. I saw the infinite void, lacking any characteristics and therefore perfect. I suddenly realized that the bigger part of myself always was the void, just like everything else. I then realized that infinity was all moments and not one after another forever. I felt ancient And the self that is only a series of experiences in the world had an entire human lifetime in an instant, and the forever part of me just touched the earth. I haven't felt the same since that day, sitting on the floor by the window. I'm still there, forever, but this fingerprint is afraid. A moment of contact with the immensity of infinity makes me feel reduced to nothing. I hope I had touched this world deliberately, and I want to go home. You can read my response to Brian in the comments of the podcast episode of that's named Nothing But the Storm. But here are the last 2 points I offered for consideration. First is that hierarchy is meaningless in an infinite reality. Secondly, meaning itself is just a frame given by the finite. The second to last chapter, the digital and the spaces between. Now, this was a very special chapter for me because whilst writing it, I actually had to come back to this chapter and do a lot of rewrites because there was a certain idea that I saw was crystallizing at this moment that needed to be expressed clearly. And whilst working on it, I definitely felt like I was going over the edge. I was losing connection to sense and reason. But once it was written, once it was down, it was like a weight was lifted off my shoulders because it had crystallized and was able to describe what I wanted to describe. The other thing that was important about this chapter was that I was away with my family, and I rarely do that because life is very busy in our house. But we did get a chance to get away, and in the first day of being away, the entire family got COVID. So we were stuck in our rental space for an entire week in bed the entire time, and this episode had just gone live, and it happened to be the biggest chapter and upload for the entire year. So that was very exciting. But what it meant was we had many comments coming in and people wanting to talk about these ideas, this idea that was so hard for me to crystallize, that they were engaging with it. So that's what myself and my wife did for half of the time that we spent there, just looking at the comments and not always having a chance to respond to them, but definitely enjoying the community that just flooded into our space at that point. So what was the idea? In part one, we discussed the nature of quantum foam, which is a theory that was offered by John Wheeler. John Wheeler is one of the proponents of quantum theory, and it basically talks about the idea of nature beyond the Planck length. Theoretically and practically impossible to measure anything. It is beyond something that we can measure in terms of material measurements, because the term material tends to not make any sense at that scale. So there is a theory that the concept of space and time breaks down, the concept of dimensions, the concept of left, right, up, down, forward and back in time, that they are far more chaotic and homogeneous at that scale. And there's theories, quantum gravity theories. Loop quantum gravity is one that we talk about closely. String theory, similar, that talk about a quantized nature of space-time. But we use that notion to try and understand the idea of this physical self and the metaphysics of what that would therefore mean in terms of the idea of identity.
The notion that I was trying to crystallize, you'd have to go and watch the entire episode, but it's essentially the concept that I like to use the metaphor of the molecule. A molecule does not exist. But in what way is what I just said true? Well, what is a molecule? Well, take a water molecule. A water molecule is the relationship of three atoms. If we just accept for the moment the atoms are real, where is the molecule? The molecule has no substance, it has no actuality. The only thing that is molecule is the emergent relationships that emerge when those three atoms combine, and when they combine, they interact with their environment in a different way. So it's a series of relationships that therefore allow for new relationships to emerge. And when we abstract those relationships from the whole, that's when we get the notion of identity. That's when we get the notion of a thing, a physical thing. But the thing isn't there in any material sense. It is only relationships. It is essentially an abstract object. And the attempt of science for the last few centuries has been to try and identify what are the fundamental real things of nature that give rise to the rest. But what we have found, and this is where the nature of quantum foam comes in, that way of looking at things is applicable ad infinitum. The same reasoning gets applied to the atoms, which gets applied to the subatomic particles, which gets applied to the probability fields and Planck lengths and so on. And you can also extrapolate it upwards rather than just down. And you find that there is nothing to the physical world apart from a series of relationships relating to relationships. That's a problem because relationships relating to relationships, there's nothing there. What is it that's doing the relating? The rational mind needs a thing to be relating, otherwise it doesn't make sense. And the thought to unpick from that is that the reason the rational mind requires the notion of thing is because that's where we live. That's what we experience. We see the objects. We measure the molecules. We know that things exist. We're justifying the necessity for these things because we think that things exist in the first place. And then when we take the things away, we still think that they should be there. But that's because that's our experience. And so in a conversation with The Watcher 2024, we went back and forth for a while about this idea that what we're talking about therefore evokes non-duality. And that's a thought that we've seen pop up in the comments several times, that it evokes non-duality. So what does that mean? Well, as I said, some people have different ideas of what non-duality is. But here's the conversation that I had with The Watcher 2024. I said, non-duality, the way I understand it, is just the acknowledgement of an ultimate oneness beyond any character, meaning it's not necessarily synonymous with idealism, which puts mind over matter. And so because of that, either the finite perspective of mind or the finite perspective of the physical can still be relevant as long as we acknowledge its relative context. The concept I offer in the chapter is that the physical world as we know it is, by its own understanding, entirely devoid of any substance, and that it only emerges in perspective. And I make the point that it emerges in perspective, but that differs from mind. So The Watcher replied, I think non-dualism has to be idealism. Number one, consciousness exists. Number two, there is no way to get from purely physical to consciousness. Well, we don't know that, but i.e. the hard problem. And number 3, the entire concept of physical implies lacking or separate from consciousness. I don't know if that's exactly what physical means, but I do know what you mean by saying that. Physical is a definition of a particular class of relationship. Physical is what physical is, but equally, mind is just what mind is. To describe either of those two categories, we have to abstract them from the whole. We have to say that they are something in and of themselves. And by saying mind, we usually refer to experience. And there is more to the nature that we experience than experience alone. By which I mean the information that comes to us comes from others. So if we are happy to accept the idea that other frames of nature, other people, are able to perceive through their filter of mind, and we have our filter of mind, there is correspondence between our two acting windows. There's correspondence between us. That correspondence isn't a part of mind insofar as the traditional definition of mind. To add that extra category, that extra quality of mind, which idealists do, they talk about God-mind, and that's the medium from which we all are connected. That's an assumption. So idealism doesn't close the loop. There was another conversation in the comments, and it began with @RatBulkin. And @RatBulkin said, I can't wrap my head around if a chair exists as an object with identity if there's no one to classify it as a chair. It seems to me that although it has the potential to be described separately from its environment, as long as the potential isn't realized by entities which build these kind of notions, the chair together with the universe is just one big inseparable mush. And a response to that from the absolute light was, it doesn't really. There are no objects. And it doesn't have to be mush to be non-separate. This is the non-dual appearing as distinctions. Humans simply mistake localized distinctions for real separateness. Nothing about the appearance of itself changes. It's just the end of thoughts believing they're separate, which is in accordance with what we've been talking about. I chimed in at one point and said I agree with the absolute light here. However, this said, the chair does also exist, in that it exists as much as you or any other thing exists. Amid the unified wholeness is the potential for infinite actuality, one of which is you and your appreciation of the chair. But while the existence and non-existence of the chair are both actual in terms of finite truth, the infinite truth is beyond words, categories, or objects. We could describe this as being infinitely contradictory or infinitely coherent. But when we do that, we only find ourselves back in the world of finite truth. It's the paradox of perspective. Chapter 13. We ask, how important is the link between the physical and the mental? And what are the rules? Because it's all good to dismiss the idea of the physical reality, but we can't deny that the physical reality exists in a finite relative perspective. To say that it's mind doesn't describe it. Let's say it is mind and it's an aspect of mind, then the aspect of mind that we call physical is what physical is. Okay, so the relationships of the physical is still what we're referring to. The fundamental source makes no odds. The fundamental reality of the physical, i.e. what we call the physical, and what we call experience, what we call consciousness, what is the connection between those two things? That's the final question that we're left with at the end of Act 1. And the main takeaways that we take from that chapter are the idea of the ship of Theseus and the teleportation dilemma, which states that if we disconnected an individual from
its physical body and moved its consciousness to somewhere else, is it still the same self? Well, because the idea of self is just a series of relationships, and the relationships are retained, then in a sense, yes, it is the same person. But also, from moment to moment, it's never one thing. That one thing doesn't actually exist. So to say yes is also incorrect. No, it's not the same thing, but not because it was interrupted, but because there is no definitive individual. That said, when we appreciate the individuality, which does exist, like the chair exists, then yes, both are true. They don't need to the contradiction doesn't need to cancel the other out. The end of the series closed with the final comments here, which I'll read for us. We could confidently describe many various and conflicting perspectives of life's story, each correct, but each infinitely incomplete, as each perspective is defined by its own horizon, some measurable mathematically, some not. Perhaps we could see our life story as living endlessly outside of time, in some perspective of reality beyond time, such as a block universe or a muddled quantum foam. We could also perceive ourselves as merely a dance of cause and effect, happening solely within time, as finite quantum playing by the rules. Or even as some unbounded sea of pure consciousness, blending in and out of all its many and alternate perspectives. Or we could just see our story through the eyes of a single other. There are an infinite count of perspectives that we could perceive the reality of our story. Many conflicting, all with an inherent truth, but all ignoring some part of the greater picture. But this is what we do. This is what we are. We are finite frames with finite understanding and finite experience. We divide time into space, into us and it, for this is what it is to be alive. Perspective. And that was the end of Act 1. I can't thank you all enough for being a part of this project. I don't find it natural to sit here and talk to cameras, but I do feel that because there's people on the other end responding, that this is something real, it's not something pretend, it's not just entertainment, it's not just performance. It might be art, but it's still real connection and real metaphysical work. So yeah, thanks for being there. Thanks for critiquing my work. I am currently working on publishing that first act. It will be an early access version just for us to share, so we can have a copy of it so that you can go through it in deeper detail if you want. I know that some people watch the episodes multiple times to try and get their heads around it. This will be the perfect opportunity for you to sit with these ideas and take them at your own pace. I will be putting up links to that publication shortly, and the idea is that together we will work towards what will eventually be the official publication of all 3 acts together. So it is a work in progress. It is something that's going to take us all several years, but we're going to do it together. Thank you to everyone who's been a part of it. Get ready for the videos. I'm already working on them. They shall be out as soon as I can manage to do them. I don't want to burn myself out, so they'll come out relatively soon, and we will start this year with Act 2, the experiential, and the first chapter is the many pages of perspective. So thanks again, much love, and I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful week. All right, bye.